I want to show you all my copy of Star Wars: The Complete Saga. Right? This is the Blu-ray edition. It has the 6 original movies written by the director, and this don't have those other 3 that was made by Disney. This was made by George Lucas right here. So to the Star Wars fan, this is the Bible of the Star Wars, right? And here's the thing. I think a lot of us read our Bibles like we watch the Star Wars trilogy. I think we read our Bibles like we do that. There's some good moral lessons there that we take from it when we watch something like that. There's some fantastic things that happen in this story. We connect all the dots. We know how everything goes together. And if you talk to some Star Wars fan, there's people who have actually written down that their religion is Jedi, okay? That's something that you'll see out there today. But then they still go about their lives. They go about their lives. They interacted with Star Wars. We interact with our Bible, and we go about our lives just like it's the same old thing. The Bible isn't pop fiction. Can I say that? The Bible isn't pop fiction. The Bible is real. And what you do with it affects eternity. How you interact with it affects eternal things, spiritual things beyond you and yourself. And the miracles that occurred within the Bible, well, they're not movie magic. No, they're real. They're real. They all occurred. And God can still do the impossible. Do you have faith that God can do the impossible? When God does the impossible, others will see His power, and there's potential for them to believe in Him. This is why God often shows off for us by doing the impossible. Has God ever done something impossible in your lives? Can I see a show of hands? Has God ever done something impossible within your life? He did something that there was no way that could have happened unless God did it. Well, let me tell you what, my salvation was pretty impossible. Can I tell you that? There was no way God was going to get me to where He needed me to be unless He did it. It is hard to imagine, I think, that a Christian could not believe in the impossible, to not believe in miracles. But the Bible is full of examples of miracles, right? For instance, when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den, God sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions. Somebody might say, well, those lions, they weren't hungry anyway that day, right? They'd already had a good meal. They weren't worried about old Daniel. This is just a natural occurrence. That's all that was happening. Those lions weren't hungry. But we know that wasn't the case. Because they threw in the men who had blamed Daniel for it once they pulled Daniel out. And it says that lions crushed their bones before they hit the ground. They eat them alive, didn't they? God made the impossible possible that day by shutting the mouths of hungry lions from eating His prophet. And as a result, the king issued a decree that the God of Daniel must be revered throughout his kingdom. Events of faith like that are all throughout the Bible. But God's people today seem to think God cannot do what has all been recorded right here within His Word. Do you have a faith? Do you have a faith like Daniel, who was thrown in the lion's den because he simply would not follow a bad law given by his king that said he could not pray to God? Let me tell you what, just because God does miracles doesn't mean bad things don't happen. Doesn't mean trial and tribulation doesn't come upon the Christian, okay? Don't get that in your mind like God's just already done everything like that. There's trials in this life and tribulations, but we can't throw miracles away because we know that. God recorded it here in His Word. Would you have faith that God could stop the mouths of lions if you were to be thrown into a pit? Do you have faith God could do that? Before we begin our study in Matthew tonight, let's define here what an impossible faith looks like. I'm going to look at 3 verses here to start off with. First is the definition of faith. What do you think faith is within the Bible? Hebrews 11:1 gives us a real good definition of what faith is. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. It's evidential, something that you can't see, and that's what faith is. You're trusting in what God has said. And what is the power of God? Let's give a definition of that. Luke 18:27, but He said, Jesus said, the things which are impossible with men are possible with God. So God can do the impossible. Do y'all believe God can do the impossible? Yeah, He can do the impossible. So faith accesses the power of God to do the impossible. Look what it says here in Mark 9:23. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Now, is that just air being thrown out in the wind? Or do you really believe that all things are possible to him who believes? Why are all things possible? Because we follow a God who can do the impossible, right? And we can't let ourselves forget that. Now, I had faith in the pew that I was just now sitting in just a moment ago. I sat down in it with my old behind. I sat down there in full assurance that I was going to sit down and I was going to hit that blue cushion that would be below my behind. And when I sat on it, I believed with all my heart. Now that is kind of a common faith, right? I think most of us can we all expect that to happen. But the impossible faith that I'm talking about here tonight is more than that. The faith we are talking about tonight sits in the chair and believes that God could rise it off the ground if He so chose to do so. Do y'all believe that? Do y'all believe that? Could He do that? God can do the impossible. Ain't nobody believing that when they sat down in that blue cushion tonight, it was going to start floating. I'm pretty sure of that. I don't think I've ever had that much faith in my life that God would raise up a pew. I don't think I have. Maybe we should have. Maybe we should believe God for the impossible. This is what happens in Matthew 9 and verse 18. I asked you to turn over there just a moment ago. Matthew 9:18. Faith to ask for something impossible. An impossible request. While He spoke these things, this was Jesus to them, behold, a ruler came and worshipped Him, saying, my daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live. So Jesus arose and followed Him, and so did His disciples. Did you hear what I just read? You weren't watching a movie. This wasn't talking some movie magic, what was going on here. He didn't just say, my daughter's sick, Jesus. Will you pray for her? He didn't just say, my daughter's on her sick bed. Could you pray for her? He said she was dead. Right? Is that what y'all read? He said she was dead. In other Gospels, it said she was at the point of death, but Matthew wants us to understand the impossibility of this situation from the very beginning. She was dead. And dead don't come back, does it? Dead don't come back. That's the way we look at it. If your daughter died, would you believe that if Jesus wanted to do it, He could raise her from the dead? Do you really believe that if God wanted to do it, He could raise her from the dead? Well, here's what I do know. There's coming a day when we're all going to rise from the dead, aren't we? Our whole faith is based on a resurrection, isn't it? A resurrection. That's what's coming up here. In just a few weeks, we talk about Easter, right? The resurrection of the Lord. And you might say, well, Pastor, you're just going too far here tonight. This just sounds kind of out there, kind of wacky, right? Well, it wasn't too far in that it's recorded in the authoritative Word of God, is it? Now notice, this man was saying some things in faith by bringing this request to Jesus. He was showing his faith by doing this. First of all, he was putting his reputation on the line. You can't have an impossible faith unless you're putting your reputation on the line. You're stepping out there when you make this kind of impossible faith. You got to see who this man was. Luke tells us in Luke 5:22, behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And this was the preacher in that town. So the preacher in the town comes up to this traveling preacher and puts his reputation on the line by asking him, you can take care of my daughter who's dead. You can do that. So everything's on the line for this old preacher, isn't it? Everything. As a matter of fact, I think he might have thought he was a little more than a traveling preacher, because that's the second thing you have to have if you're going to have an impossible faith. You have to put your reputation on the line. You have to become shameless. Like I said last Sunday, we have to have a shameless faith in our God, right? Not only do we have to have that shameless faith, we have to believe that Jesus is God. Do you believe when you get down and pray that you're actually talking to God? Do you believe that? That you're really talking to the Creator of the universe? Today I got to meet the mayor of Knox County. He was a famous wrestler at one time, right? I thought that was so cool. But when I bow down upon my knees and I call out to the living God of heaven and earth, I'm talking to the most famous person, famous being that there ever was, right? I'm talking to God. I'm talking to Him. So this man believed Jesus held the keys to life and death in His hands. And only God truly has that kind of power. And I believe that this man thought that this was God he was talking to. He wasn't just breathing some prayers out. He wasn't just saying some words. He was talking to God here, the one who can bring life. And this request was clearly an impossible request by any human estimation. If you're dead, unless you're shocked back, you're dead. They didn't have no shock paddles back then, all right? This was not a resuscitation request. They weren't asking Jesus come give mouth to mouth to the little girl and push on her chest some to get her breathing again. That wasn't what was occurring. This girl was far away and was already dead. This was absolutely an impossible request. And unless Jesus said yes, and He did, Jesus arose and followed Him, they said, that would make all the difference. Once Jesus got up, now the impossible was possible, right? But the man had to ask. You do not have because you do not ask. Y'all ever heard that before? It's in the Bible, isn't it? You don't have because you don't ask. Why don't we ask? If Jesus hadn't gotten up, though, what would have happened? The little girl would stay dead, but this man was willing to put his reputation and his heart into the fact that if Jesus wanted to change this situation, He could do it. You believe God could do it? I have to ask, do you even ask in the impossible situation? Or you just consider it impossible? Do you just give up? Ain't nothing can be done. Don't even bother to ask God about it. Don't even consider. And if it's even a consideration, it's not because you're believing He's God and He can do it. It's not because you're willing to put your reputation on the line by sitting and saying, God, won't you do it? It's just an afterthought. It's an afterthought. Some prayer requests, I really think sometimes, are afterthoughts. We'll add a little icing on top of the cake, you know. The prayer can change things. The prayer can change the situation. We have to believe that. We have to. The world don't believe that. We have to believe that. And He asked for the impossible. And next here we're going to see a woman who didn't give up, even if God had said no for a while. Look here at verse 20. verse 20. And we're going to go through verse 22. And suddenly a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years came from behind and touched the hem of his garment. For she said to herself, if only I may touch his garment, I shall be made well. But Jesus turned around, and when he saw her, he said, be of good cheer, daughter. Your faith has made you well. And the woman was made well from that hour. This woman interrupted the travel to the man's home because she had had a flow of blood for 12 years. Now let me tell you what that flow of blood caused to happen within her life. During this time, she was unable to even worship in the temple because she was considered unclean. She couldn't even worship. She couldn't be around her synagogue family. She couldn't go down there. And it might seem like everyone had left her, but even when she couldn't make it to the temple, she still had an impossible hope that everyone else had given up on so long ago. She still believed God cared and would help if it was His will. Could you wait 12 years dealing with a situation and still believe in your heart to have the impossible faith that God cares, and if He wants to fix this, He can? Would you? Would you? This woman did. Obviously, she had heard about the man from Galilee preaching across the countryside and decided that he was her connection to get a hold of God's help. So what did she do? She did just like the other man. She put her reputation on the line. She's going to touch this Jewish man, which was totally a no-no. She was going to touch him. So she's putting her reputation on the line, and I'm pretty certain that she believed she was getting a hold of God. Somebody need to get a hold of God here tonight? Somebody need to get a hold of God? We all need to get a hold of God, don't we? For something going on within our life. She decided, if only I could get a hold, not of all of Jesus, not get a hold of Him around the waist, if I could just get a hold of the very hem of His garment, just the little bit that I could get a hold of. That hem, that very turn, right there along the bottom side. Now, this is what I think. We believe our belief in God is too small. You hear me? I'm talking about myself here too. Our belief in God sometimes is too small. It can't last nowhere near 12 years. It sure ain't going to ask for the impossible. Our belief in God is too small. There's a British philosopher, Evelyn Underhill, famously said this. He said, if God were small enough to be understood, He would not be big enough to be worshipped. Our God is a big God. I can't understand everything about God. Can you understand everything about God? I can't understand everything about God. I can read His Word and take in what little bit I have, but I can't understand everything about God. I can be wrong. I can make mistakes. God can't do that. He knows it all. And as Americans, I think we prefer a God who is small. We like to be in control, don't we? We like to handle the situation. A God we can manage. A God we can predict. A God that we can control. That kind of God feels safe to us. We can understand Him. He thinks like we do. He always does what we want. We can explain Him. He doesn't embarrass us. He doesn't confuse us. He doesn't disappoint us. But the fact is that God simply isn't real. This is simply not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is the opposite of small and manageable. He is big. He is huge. He is not just big, He's bigger than big, okay? He is bigger than all the words that we can use to say big, all right? He defies our ability to categorize or describe Him in any way. We have our minuscule little ways of trying to understand Him, try to put Him into a box. We try our best to understand Him. I believe we should try to understand Him. But friends, you're never going to completely understand Him because He's God. Most Americans want this. They want a God who is only slightly bigger, slightly smarter version of us. right? But the God of the Bible is just not a better version of you. He is altogether different. His very name is holy, set apart. Right? He's God, and we're not. We need to open our eyes and take a good long look at who God is. That's what Isaiah 40, verse 25 and 26 tells us. It says, to whom then will you liken me? This is talking about God, liken me. Or to whom shall I be equal? God ain't equal to nobody. Nothing can be compared with God, says the Holy One, the separate one. Lift up your eyes on high, he says, and see who has created these things. Everything you're looking around at you right now, even your own body and your own soul, was created by God. Everything. And everything can be taken away by that very same God, just in an instant. He is in complete control. He is in a category all his own. And knowing this brings strength and vitality to us. To us. By knowing my God can do all things, I get some comfort from that, don't you? I get some peace from that, knowing that. It's not strength in myself I gain, but I'm encouraged here, but strength in Him. In the sovereign, all-powerful, all-wise, all-sustaining, never-tiring God. I tell you what, atheists like to make fun of us and say our God's a crutch. Yes, He is. I lean on Him all the time, don't you? Leaning on the everlasting arms is what the old hymn says. Leaning on the everlasting arms. And Jesus looked at the woman, and what did He say? Your faith has made you well. Jesus said that she needed to believe, and that belief secured the healing. She didn't heal herself, but she had to reach out to receive the healing if it was His will. If it was His will. She had to ask. She had to reach out. She had to show that faith, give that faith. Again, I have to ask you again here tonight. Do you even ask in the impossible situation? Do you even ask, or do you give up? Now, if you don't give up, I'm going to tell you what to expect. I'm going to tell you what she got for 12 years. And what Jesus got when He come upon the doors of where this little girl was at. If you don't give up, expect to be ridiculed if you have an impossible faith. This is what it says here. When Jesus came into the ruler's house and saw the flute players and the noisy crowd wailing, He said to them, make room, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping. And they ridiculed Him. But when the crowd was put outside, He went in and took her by the hand, and the girl arose. And the report of this went out into all the land. When you go to ask the impossible, expect the world will see it as it is. You're trying to do something impossible. That's ridiculous. Now, these mourners were a bunch of fakers anyway. They were most likely paid to mourn this little girl. This is what a funeral was like back then. They actually paid people to come in and mourn for you after you died. It was the custom of the day to pay for someone to mourn over the dead body. Who paid them? That's what I thought. Who paid them? It wasn't the man. Where was he at? He went to go get God, didn't he? He was down there. He wasn't looking for a funeral, was he? He had an impossible faith, didn't he? He wasn't looking for the funeral. He was looking for the salvation. So who paid him? Perhaps the man's wife. You don't hear about her going looking for Jesus. She had to succumb to what she believed was the reality of the situation. Something I could imagine him telling her telling him. And she didn't seek any help. The mourners were fake, paid to look like they cared, but the one who cared was walking in the door that day, wasn't he? So the Jewish leader's wife may have rejected his foolish faith in the impossible. And the town was already having the funeral. And they all thought this man was a joke who walked in. And this crazy preacher that he brought with him was a joke too. What would you think? Let's look at this in reality. We're not playing Star Wars here. Let's look at this in reality. They bring a man down. The girl's dead in there. It's a funeral. She's laying here in a casket, right? She's laying here in a casket. And the dad comes in. And he's got this man with him that's a preacher, traveling preacher. And the man wants to get in, the mourners, and he says, she's just asleep up there. What would you do? What would you do? What would I do? We'd be like, oh, it's what we do. It's because we can't have an impossible faith. Because we don't have an impossible faith. So this is what happened here. Everybody thought what most of us would think until the little girl got up. Until the little girl got up. Let's walk out these doors tonight with a belief that God can do the impossible. Let's realize that we serve a truly big God. You know, Tony Evans, he told a story of this evangelistic crusade they were having in this big football field. And he said they had heard right before the evangelistic meeting was about to happen, there were these storm clouds coming in from all over the place, right? These storm clouds were coming in. And he said, well, the preachers got together and they were going to have their customary prayer meeting because they knew this was current. And so the preachers got up and they prayed these really safe prayers. These really safe prayers, you know. And it really didn't, you know, just your normal run-of-the-mill prayer. And there was this little woman in the back. She'd helped get a lot of this together. And they said, well, ma'am, would you like to come up? This little tiny short woman. She come up. And she didn't pray an ordinary prayer. She didn't pray a run-of-the-mill prayer, anything like that. She looked up to God and she said, you told us to do this. You told us to have this meeting. You told us, God, if you don't make these clouds part, you're going to embarrass yourself. And the preachers were like, oh my goodness. Right? My goodness, what in the world? And she prayed with full faith that God can and should do this. Because he said this is what he wanted. Dr. Evans said that while he was up there preaching, there were storms all over the area. But when the cloud come up to that football field, the clouds parted and went around. There wasn't no rain in there. Do you believe God can do the impossible? If not, maybe that's why we're not seeing the impossible accomplished in our lives. There's nothing, there is absolutely nothing that God cannot do if He is willing to do it. Nothing. I hope you're enjoying the sermons here and have subscribed to my channel on YouTube. But I would love even more to meet with you in person at the church where I'm blessed to pastor at in White Pine, Tennessee, Omega Baptist Church.